Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Edge Report. I've got Shannon Dobbs with me today. Shannon, welcome, man.
Hey, how's it going? Good to see you,
So,
Chris.
Shannon and I got to know each other just recently and through LinkedIn. We connected, which started as a 20-minute conversation, I think was a close to an hour and a half. Uh, the idea here is just to sort of have another one of those conversations and record it and share it with the world. So, Shannon, why don't you share with the listeners and viewers, a brief bit of your history, your background?
Okay, so real briefly, was an Army soldier back in the 90s. Was involved with some special ops work out in Fort Bragg. Got out in 98 and found out that the job I'd been trained on was there was no positions available in the world for a college dropout. So I ended up kicking around Las Vegas for a few years, driving taxis and trying to figure out what my next step was. Ultimately ended up in Northern Nevada running bars and nightclubs, which was my passion. And in 2014, I had to file with the federal government for disability because I'd gotten in a parachuting accident in '95, and the damage that was caused basically was starting to interfere with my ability to do business. So I pretty much hung up my shingle and turnkeyed the business and spent a couple of years trying to figure out, find a buyer and really exit out of that. Turned into kind of an existential crisis where I was trying to figure out what are my next steps? Like, who am I if I'm not an entrepreneur? Who am I if I'm not this and this and that? 15, I got an understanding for the first time that our leadership didn't really have any idea what to do with the food desert situation. When I read this article where the mayor was quoted as asking, why can't we get a grocery store in downtown Reno? And that sent me into I just got really interested in that because I'm like, as a retailer, that didn't make a lot of sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
Retail's not that complicated of a process. What's so hard about putting a grocery store in here? So I started asking a bunch of questions, and something just wasn't adding up. So I kind of followed through this process. I had some commercial property that I offered to donate to just build a grocery store. It's like, hey, let's put it in here. Found out that the city and the nonprofits in the area and pretty much everybody that was supposedly involved with this wanted nothing to do with that. And in beginning of 2016, I started a nonprofit organization called On Common Ground, essentially for the purpose of doing that thing that I had come up with. Fast forward 8 years, and I've been through a whole lot of iteration. The Northern Nevada project never really got off the ground. We had the business halfway built, and community pressure actually forced the property owner to kick us out of the building and seize all
Mm-hmm.
of our donated equipment. That was when I started really getting an understanding that this was a different situation from what I had first understood it to be. So that kind of that kind of was the beginning of my journey into the nonprofit world and into food justice and getting involved as an advocate.
Mm-hmm.
I moved to Mexico for a couple of years, ended up in Colorado, where I started meeting a whole bunch of people in the regenerative agriculture movement. And I started putting these pieces together of these different components that I kept coming across. I kept having really awesome conversations with folks about little pieces of the puzzle that were happening here and there all over the country and all around the world. And I started seeing patterns that led me to the understanding that there was potentially a system we could put together to where we could add all of these things into a matrix that would kind of make more sense, accelerate our capacities, and really kind of move us forward in a way that we need to go in a much more rapid way. And so that's what I've been doing the last couple of years, is essentially putting together that system and trying to figure out how to outreach that and connect with stakeholders and connect with all the players that we need to do in order to be able to effectuate these solutions.
Yeah, man, I love your mind. I really do. I love that, it started with food desert, then it went to food justice, then it went to food systems, then it went to regenerative food systems. And that's really where, our conversation resonated the last time we talked. Before we go too far into that, I want to call out your post from today because
Mm, thank you.
I just saw it. We were a little delayed in getting started here because you were probably passionately engaged with somebody before our podcast time, and you
No
lose track
problem.
of time when you talk about systems crumbling. So, um, I just wanted to start by reading just the first couple of lines, if that's all right with you.
Please. Yeah.
Yeah. So it says, "This morning, before the world fully awoke, two messages found their way to me, two visions of the movement that we're living through, as different as darkness and dawn. The first spoke of monsters emerging from decay, of systems crumbling, of shadows lengthening, a familiar narrative heavy with fear. But then came another voice, singing of sprawling in autumn leaves, of feeling earth alive beneath us, of returning to that 5-year-old sense of wonder, of being gobsmacked by the ocean and listening to trees whisper their ancient wisdom. You know, I'm right here with you. Like half of my calls are doom and gloom. but building resilient communities. My service has been called to the front lines of Helene relief, and now again, my efforts are being called to LA. But yet, the positive side of the work is just so positive, and it's so regenerative, and it's so interesting. And we're in that messy middle. So, I love your post. I will link to the post in the liner notes here because I love that you bring play back into it, and exploration, and how important it is to find joy in the journey itself. So share with us a little bit on sort of what you were thinking about when you wrote that.
Well, I mean, this has been a personal journey for me. I'm going to say that when things came to a head in 2019 in Northern Nevada, I had something of a nervous breakdown. I didn't see hope. And my path down to Mexico was really an escape. I checked out. I was like, I'm done. I'm out of here. And I ended up really getting an opportunity to heal during the year and a half that I was down there. I spent time on a beach during COVID and, out of the constant 24-hour fear cycle that we see here in the United States. And I just checked out of all of it. And that gave me a different perspective that I desperately needed. Mm. And when I came back in country in 2021, came back in country actually to file divorce paperwork. And that was, that was its own kind of trauma and trials. And I was going to therapy, and my therapist and me and my therapist were talking about it. And I had this feeling like I wanted to close down, like I could never love again. And it was despair. And it took me a little while to kind of see the other side of that path and the value of keeping my heart open and of really centering, that openness and really just letting the universe in and really just not allowing myself to become hard. And I think this is maybe a repeat cycle too, because after I got out of the military, I felt that way. You get out of being a soldier and getting out of that environment, and it takes you a while to kind of reprogram and really understand, what am I besides this? And I think a lot of soldiers never really get that. And that's one of the challenges that we deal with. And this is one of the reasons why people, why soldiers commit suicide, is because they don't see like what their worth is outside of that, and they don't see how to get away from that feeling of guardedness and that feeling like everything is an enemy and everybody is an enemy and that kind of thing. And so that's been a very intentional path for me for a long time. And having gone through that personally, I can really see how we're collectively going through it too. And I mean, I see the messaging, and I see the intent behind the messaging. That was part of my job in the Army was influential messaging and that kind of thing. And so I understand that there's intent, is that sowing fear and creating despair and creating the sense of hopelessness is kind of the point. And so it's really, like I said in the post, it's a revolutionary act to maintain that hope and to maintain that light and that sense of joy, and dancing and coming together with community over potlucks and just doing those things that we need to do to be humans. It's so important.
Yeah, it is. I got two guests that were part of the Edge Report. Darren Murph, who's a friend and mentor, and Rex Miller, who's also a friend and mentor. And both of them coincidentally talked about creating margin. And, it sounds to me like distance and margin for you gave you perspective. And that tends to be the truth, right? When you stop toiling and you start thinking, the world can become a beautiful thing. It's also a dangerous place for a lot of organizations, right? If everybody's thinking and not doing, then you tend to end up with operational efficiency issues.
Right.
So it's ironic. And I love that you found a lot of this purpose and hope in food and regenerative agriculture, because it is such an important discussion. It's literally what fuels us as humans, is what we put into our body, whether that's ingesting communication, ingesting media, ingesting music, ingesting views, ingesting love, or ingesting nutrition. One of the most important things that we can do for ourselves is understand our food. And we've become very detached from it, let alone access to it in the food desert conversation that you were having in food injustice. But just the very fact of where does our food come from and food origin, that has changed. So let's go down that path a little bit and maybe inform some folks that know that their food maybe doesn't have an origin or that they've lost touch with it. But let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, that's a deep rabbit hole.
We got it, man.
I mean, you've got, so the basic thing I think that people really need to understand is that going back to the practices from the 1920s, like a lot of people learned in high school about the Dust Bowls in the 20s, but what we don't connect the dots on why those dust bowls existed and what caused them and what created them. And so, very, very few years before that, as a country, as a nation, I'm just talking about America, but the United States kind of led the world in a lot of these things. And so we started adopting industrial practices in the early 90s, and we started like coming up with these new inventions for chemicals, for fertilizer, and we started coming up with these new. And so what they did was they took all these natural processes and they said, "Ooh, we can synthesize this in a lab, and then we can make it cheaper, and we can make it widely available, and we can expand our blah blah blah, and we could go through this all." And so they had this pie in the sky, kind of 19th century almost colonialist expansions mindset of like, let's go carpet the world. Like, I don't know, there's a company out there that says we're going to paint the planet or something like that. So it's like we have this idea of technology can fix everything. And so we started creating these industrial processes, and that conventional that farming process became the convention. And fast forward to the 1920s and 30s, right about the time that the bottom was dropping off of our stock market and people were going unemployed and everything like that, you had these visuals of the Dust Bowls in Texas and in Oklahoma and other areas where the wind was coming through and it was lifting the dirt off of the earth and just making it go away. And all you had was bare bedrock underneath and just lifeless. You can't grow anything on it. And what's fascinating to me is that we're going that route again. Like a really big part of what's driving climate change is our conventional farming. And what's really interesting about that is that the processes that we use to work the land and the artificial pesticides and the fertilizers that we put on the land is actively degrading the nutrient value of the soil itself. And so it's creating this feedback loop. It's like a death spiral where the land, the food that we create is not every year, it's got less and less nutrient value. So the apple that we eat has, I think, 30% nutritive capacity less than it did back in the 1970s. Mm-hmm. And this is across the entire spectrum. And I don't even want to get into the whole GMO argument. Like there's a whole lot of stuff that we're doing that's just absolutely fucking stupid. Mm-hmm. But just that fact that we systematized and standardized the process of what we call conventional agriculture, that's one of the major driving forces that's driving us off a cliff right now.
Yes.
And I think it's just insane that we're going that route. And what's happening that I'm kind of excited about is there's this growing recognition that this is fact. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand the mechanisms behind that or the reasons behind that. You kind of got to dig deep and talk to some folks before you can really, dig out the nuggets. But this regenerative movement that we're dealing with is literally like it's rebuilding the soil. It's about stepping away from these conventional practices, going back to indigenous knowledge, going back to these original practices where we were stewarding the land, and recognizing that we need to rebuild this soil because that's what we live off of. I mean, we got literally 6 inches of topsoil on this planet. If that wasn't there, we wouldn't exist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And a couple of words for people to put into their vocabulary that are important to look into. Permaculture being one of them, agroforestry being another one, soil microbiomes. Some of the research that I did in regenerative agriculture stems from our investment in land in the southwestern corner of Virginia, right? We had happened into this land that had not really ever seen modern agribusiness, yet it was farmland. So it was, for some generations was passed down from the 1800s. And right, exactly. We all of a sudden realized that we had this valuable resource. And, what's interesting, and I think you and I touched on this during our last conversation, was the asset value of that, how it's not, right now, there's no way for the market to value that asset of pure land with deep soil. It's still the cost per acre as if it were a monoculture Fraser for a Christmas tree farm or pumpkin farm like that's found around us. Mm-hmm. But it's not the value of our property because of the fact that we can pretty much validate and secure 150 or 200 years without, agricultural intervention or chemical intervention, pesticides, neonicotinoids, none of that. So it's interesting how market can drive that kind of conversation too, where, we're getting to the point where there are so many dependencies. You own a piece of farmland and you plan on growing on it. You better know what's going to grow because not much will if it's been a monoculture farm for 50 or 60 years.
Yeah. And you touched on a really solid point there. You talk about the market value of the land is inextricably tied to its productive capacity. And like you said, we don't really have a recognition of land that hasn't been producing of what that capacity is. So one of the strategies that I like the best about the regenerative movement is that we are moving away from this idea that we just need to conserve land untouched. Because that's kind of the, if you talk to folks in the USDA or NRSC, they're really focused on the conservation side. Like, they pay people just to not do anything with their land.
They do.
Which is fine. I mean, you get a couple of $1,000, it pays your property tax, you just leave it the hell alone, and that's fine for to an extent. But where the real value is when you start geoengineering that land, when you start putting swales in place so that you're capturing water, when you start developing cover crop crops, when you start really actively working towards a productive capacity for that land, because then the market has something to recognize. Now it's got something it can sink its teeth into, and right there is what's going to help us with the narrative as we're moving forward. The more that we can do that, and the more that we can show the productive capacity of regenerative agriculture and how it can compete in the market with conventional practices, I think that's where we're going to start really making some sea changes in how people perceive this movement.
Yeah, for sure. And also there's so many practices that are, 40, 50 years old that still the narrative is that they work, right? So if you got involved in agricultural technology in the 50s versus getting involved in agricultural technology now, generationally, people our age have been fighting people our parents' age, because most of the time it's generational farming. And what worked for our parents isn't necessarily going to work for us because of market dynamics, whether it's co-op silage that, if you're a corn farmer, so to speak, and you're going to co-op your product, you're going to be dependent upon whatever the market supply demand is at that time. And you're going to get a check based on how much silage you put up in the co-opt silo, right? So, versus being an independent farmer and struggling to make your way through. So it's kind of like a bird in the hand for two in the bush, right? And so many of my friends have been struggling generationally to explain to their parents what regenerative farming is, because to their parents, it's, what are you talking about? This is where you buy the seed. This is when you put the first fertilizer down. It's when you put the second fertilizer down. This is when you cut. Don't ever change that. This is already hard enough. We barely get by. If we got one frost or one wind, we're screwed. You want to go changing the whole process, right? So that's a lot of it too, is sort of letting some of these legacy systems pass and proving things out in a small way over time. And that's hard, because there is an existential crisis here. We have to get to work. And economically, it doesn't make sense to convert a monoculture farm to a regenerative farm overnight. It won't work.
Right. You got to do it in stages. I've seen some folks talking about processes and ways that they've figured out of kind of stepping this in over maybe a 3-year period, and really kind of like, because you can cut the swales this year, you can do this year, you can transition out. One of the things that I've been really fascinated about recently, I'm discovering that there's some folks down in Australia that figured out a biological based solution that can create a hydrophilic relationship with the soil. And they can actually help to revitalize the soil at a rapid pace. I'm loving the direction that they're going with that. But yeah, the conversation's a really big part of it. I remember when I first took over Five Star Saloon in Reno, the first thing I did, I was an engineering student for a while before I jumped ship and went in the business. And I went around and counted the light bulbs, and I realized that all the light bulbs were incandescent still in the bar. And so I counted, there was 72 light bulbs in the place. It was a 24-hour bar, so they were on all the time. And so I'm sitting here with my little, back in the napkin, and I'm calculating it out. And I figured, okay, I can save X amount of dollars if I switch this over to LEDs. And I calculated the cost of the LEDs and everything like that. And then I went around and screwed in all the different light bulbs. And then over the course of 11 years, I went back and figured out how much money I saved, and thereby how much money I put in my pocket just from that one move. And I wonder if we couldn't even start framing it in that direction, to where we help farmers understand that the money that they save in the long term from not putting the pesticides on every year, from just putting in the work right up front, is going to pay off dividends for generations by taking those expenses and those connections. And especially one of the things that I see is that control mechanism that's involved with you get, and again, that's going into the GMO argument too, because the GMO food is genetically designed to recognize certain types of chemicals.
Yes.
And so it doesn't die and everything around it dies.
That's
because they handshake. But that means that you're tied to that chemical for the rest of the time that you're making that food. And so that creates it's not a symbiotic, it's a parasitic relationship where the chemical companies
dependency.
basically have, yeah. And so, I mean, if the ultimate goal, and this is one of the things I actually like about the America First movement, is that if our goal is independence and sovereignty, and us being in control of our lives, then that's one of the things that we need to push on. And the farming community, I mean, that's one of the sectors in the United States that's, the most receptive to that kind of messaging.
So I have a friend of mine that, to touch on your energy anecdote there with your light bulbs. So right now I always take a continuing ed course. I'm always taking something. And right now I'm taking energy within environmental constraints. And it starts to measure, human energy, because we forget that we just devalue our own human input. And one of my friends has a farm, and I was helping him through a business perspective on measuring input output. And 67% of his crop was dependencies. The first 67% of every dollar, first 67 cents, the sunk cost up front to get seed, to get starter fert, to get second fert, and to get his crop planted, diesel fuel, was 67% of his dollar. And so, you're left with 33% up to fate, weather, human labor, right? And then at the end, his product was a commodity. Still didn't know what the value of that crop was going to be. So if there was a bumper crop for everybody, demand is going to stay the same, supplies through the roof, he's going to get paid like shit. So literally, he was giving up almost 70% before he even got started because of the way he was approaching it with dependencies, going to the seed and seed, traditional agricultural processes. And he's changed that, obviously. He started to realize that he might be able to charge more he might have less yield, but he might have more value in his yield, because he's got to create his story, and he's got to create his brand, and then he's got to create his awareness. Those distribution channels are something that he never thought about. He took them for granted that he was just going to pay to the commoditized market. It would eventually get sent to the grocery store and put into the industrial food system, and he was going to get paid a commoditized price. That was just the way his mind always worked, because he was a monocrop. And now he's sitting there going, oh, my family garden that I grow over here, that I eat, all of this stuff, all of that diversity, there's probably more value in that to sell than there is, 100 acres. Because over here, I can prove my value, and I can prove all the time, energy, and effort that went into it. So, wow, world.
It is. Well, and this is, okay, so now you're touching on my world, because I'm not coming from the farmer community, I'm coming from the city. And what blows my mind is even the regenerative farmers, even the folks that are deep into this stuff and understand the need for parallel food hubs and distribution, there's this common sense that I see over and over again in this community, that the city is somehow off limits.
Mm-hmm.
And that, once it leaves the farm, that's the last I see of my food, and I got nothing to do with it. And I have nothing, and there's nothing I can do in the city to change anything. And so I'm at the mercy of the grocery stores, and I'm at the mercy of the distribution channels and everything like that. And that blows my mind, because at the same time, I go out and I see farmers markets, and I see food hubs, and I see all of these structures out in the farming community where everybody obviously knows how to do mercantile operations. Everybody knows how to buy and sell stuff. But then we've got this situation where you've got food deserts in inner city areas that supermarkets can't go into, that are literally markets ready to get exploited. And it's been nearly impossible to even get a conversation going with farmers about, hey, I got this model for a grocery store. Why don't we put our heads together and put it into an inner city area, and then just open up a pipeline directly into the city? Like that's the thing that I think we need to have a conversation about. And I was actually having a discussion with somebody yesterday about how I've been in the regenerative movement for, less than a year now. I'm relatively new, but I keep having conversations with folks, and I keep getting this impression that the city is a blind spot, and it's a place that is somehow being deemed as separate and outside of the ecological system that we live in. And I think that's a mistake that we're making collectively, is to not calculate that in when we're talking about our systems design. So that if there's anything that we could possibly do with the regenerative movement that would expand our capabilities and our capacities, it would be to try and figure out, One of the biggest driving forces of climate change is food waste. Approximately 35% of greenhouse gases that are being emitted that are driving us off a cliff right now are coming from our food system. So if we can figure out a way to get that compost or get that agricultural gold out of the city and back into the country, if we can shorten supply chains and get regional pipelines into the inner city so that we're not completely tied into the global supply chain, if we can create a sorting mechanism so that some of these resources that, like I'm in Colorado, it takes a lot of money to get food into the mountains. We don't grow a lot. We got potatoes and chilies and a couple other, bumper crops. And other than that, it's just, it's all imports. You go to places like Hawaii and it's even worse. Everything's an import. And so the fact that we don't spend really any time kind of figuring out like how is this part of the agricultural system? How can we incorporate these city mechanics in what we're doing? I think that's going to be not the key, but certainly a key to turning a lot of this stuff around.
Well, let's flip the focus a little bit too, because I know that you've got a pretty good perspective on this. You know that I write a lot about resilient communities, right? And resiliency, like there's a couple things we can't live without as humans, right? Can't live without water, and we can't live without shelter, and we can't live without food, right? So building resilient communities depends on how far into the bedrock we want to go and into discussions. But I think people were exposed to the fragility of our distribution systems and our just-in-time grocery systems of our industrialized and centralized food processing in the U.S.
2020.
So help me with that a little bit. I know you got a great PsyOps brain and you're a great systems thinker. I'm always talking about resilient communities. Let's pick on how we can create more resilient supply chains that are less dependent upon that. How do we bring that manufacturing process, or how do we bring that distribution center closer?
Okay, well, let's walk through a scenario. So imagine, if you will, that you've got, I'm going to pick on Denver because, I'm right here. Denver's got food deserts all over the city. You got little pockets where people can't get access to food. And if you don't have a car, you don't have personal transportation, it'll take you hours to get to where the food is. So what happens is, as humans, we naturally go to what's easy or what we can, what we have the time and the capability to be able to get to. And a lot of times that ends up being a microwavable burrito at the corner bodega. Or the gas station or whatever. So that's kind of the trend of where we're going from a health perspective. And what's really interesting is that we've got this crazy disconnect between the professional organizations. Again, I'm on the city side, but if you talk to a doctor, even the doctors that are super embedded in the idea of food as medicine, there's been programs where they will literally write you a prescription that's a grocery list, and they'll say you need to eat these foods. But what happens is when you get into these low-income communities and these underserved communities, is what they call them, that don't have the access to the healthy food, they're going to look at the doctor and they're going to say, well, cool, where can I get this food? And the doctor is going to be, not my problem. And the city planners are going to be, not my problem. And everybody else is going to be, not my problem. So basically, we have all collectively abdicated our responsibility to have healthy access to food to our populace, to the profit sector, to the supermarkets. And basically saying, not our problem. And this is including the nonprofit sector. They won't touch it. It's the third rail. And so imagine, if you will, that you got, okay, actually, here's a really good scenario because I've got this built out at multiple scales. So imagine you got a dead restaurant in one of these communities. You got one of those places that's boarded up. It's an old, I don't know, pick a restaurant, doesn't matter. And it's got a decent seating capacity. It's got a nice commercial kitchen. It's got a decent sized parking lot, and it's sitting there centrally located next to a bus stop. So it's perfect position. There's thousands of them. There's millions of them all over the country, especially after COVID. So you take over one of these locations and you convert the kitchen into a last mile food rescue location, which just basically means you add a blast chiller, you bring in a couple pieces of equipment, you line it out so it's not necessarily retail service like it was, it's just using it for a different function. A commercial kitchen is a commercial kitchen. I had a certified commercial kitchen on a bar side that was about 3 square feet. Then you rip out the seating area and turn that into a grocery store. Then you reach out to all of the farmers and you say, hey, why don't you come in here once a week and plop down a farmer's market in the parking lot? Then you go across the street to the park and you'd be like, hey, let's create yoga and let's do events and let's have a barbecue and let's set up some grills and everybody can bring their whatever. And we got all the produce and we start doing this and you create like almost a community potluck. So that's the local community center. That's where you get your connection. That's where you get your access. That's where you get your cooking classes. That's where you start showing people how to use raw foods like spices and pantry staples to be able to create healthy meals at home. That's where you show people how to use Instant Pots and other plug-in cookware to do just add water cooking at home if they don't have functional kitchens. That's where you start building this out. That's where you start signing people up to SNAP, getting people connected to resources, getting people connected up to everything else that we've got, that all of the nonprofit organizations are struggling to get signups. You do it by building that capacity at the neighborhood level. And you don't do it like I don't do it. You partner up with existing organizations and existing community groups and existing churches in that community, and you support them in doing it. Now you've got that capacity at the grassroots level. Well, in order to make that more efficient, in order to make it more profitable, you need to be able to bypass the wholesalers. Because I learned this from a guy named Doug Rao. He's the former CEO of Trader Joe's. And I had a really cool conversation with him back in 2017, where he basically said the wholesalers will eat your lunch. He started up the first nonprofit grocery store in America, to my knowledge, a place called Daily Table out in the Boston area. And he's up to like 5 or 6 stores now. He's doing great. So what he said is that the best way to structure this is to create a hub and spoke model. So you got all these spokes going into the community, right, and then you create a hub that's essentially a warehouse where you can bring in larger pallet-sized orders of food. That's what that does is allows you to negotiate directly with the farmers. So that mechanism allows you to break it down internally. Now, in order to break food down internally in the United States, you have to have a commercial kitchen in order to touch the food. Now, that's really interesting because if you've got a warehouse and you got a commercial kitchen, now you can start ideating, what else can I do with that commercial kitchen? Well, now we got this strategy out of Las Vegas where we can rescue prepared meals. We can take cut fruits and vegetables. We can take end-of-life foods. We can use them as ingredients. I mean, fucking dairy is the largest food waste component in America. You know how many ingredients, you know how many products I can make with and grains, and then some fruits and vegetables and shit like that, like everything from pot pies to you name it. It's all across the board. So you start creating that. Now you start creating your own capacity internally. Now you've got branded food that's essentially made in wherever that you go out. Now you've got community pride. Now you start having this, you start having this commonality of like, oh, this brand is Colorado's brand. This is the Front Range brand. This is, and you make something up. It doesn't matter what it is. And then once you've got that capacity, now you've got a sorting mechanism, because that's the other thing a commercial kitchen can do. And you've got job skills training, and you've got certification processes, and you've got cooking classes, and you've got, again, larger scale, larger capacity, and you create an event space as part of it. So now you're bringing the community together, and you've got parties and fundraisers and all of these different things. So that's great. So now you've got essentially a complete system in the urban area that's servicing the farming community and that's providing this access and that's utilizing these resources that's going into our landfills in a way that actually makes sense. We're actually utilizing our resources. Well, we're not going to be able to save all the food, right?
No, you can't. And I know what you're getting at. The goal, how does it return back to the farm?
So what the hell do we do with the rest of the food? Okay, well, now we've got that biodigester. Now we've got black soldier flies. Now we've got reactors that can turn everything from plastics to shitty food into biochar. We got all of these different mechanisms that we got out there. Well, guess what? The farming community understands that capacity in a way that the urban environment could never get their heads around. And then you got the whole NIMBY thing anyway. You don't want a biodigester in the middle of the city. Nobody's gonna love it. Maybe I don't know. There's certain industrial areas.
A couple of towns I could think of would love it, but not too many.
But here's the thing, and this is one of the key components that I've been trying to get people's heads around, is that you don't have to have the farm all on the farm. And the business model I developed is called Fractal Farms for just that reason, because you could have a 5-acre plot right over here that's running a biodigester. You could have a commercial property in the city that's doing this other thing. You could have all of these little commercial properties all over the place that's doing these other things, and it's still one entity. It's still one controllable mechanism. It's still one connectivity matrix. So if you get systems like that, and all of that is supporting a common goal of let's increase regenerative capacity. Well, let's take it one step farther. What if that system was supporting a tool library?
Absolutely.
Like you got punch tractors.
Absolutely.
You got cover crop. What's the little sieve circular thing that goes and crushes the cover crops?
Well, there's wheel discs. There's all sorts of things. Aerators. There's all kinds of things.
And then you ideate maybe a step farther. What about turning that tool library into an agriculturally focused makerspace?
I love it.
What if you take, so everybody knows what a 3D printer is at this point. It spits out plastic and makes cute little toys and whatever. Well, I found out that there's 3D printers that can print titanium and ceramic and all kinds of stuff, that you can make parts for tractors, that you can fabricate new designs for prototype materials, that you can like ideate solutions for, basically an entrepreneurial aspect of it. So if you're supporting at that level, now you're creating a true, like a positive, virtuous cycle where you're building on each success to build capacity. And if you're doing that in a way that's distributed governance, I mean, you bring in the DAO so that people understand that they've got the governance capacity. It's not some top-down thing coming from the government or some crap like that. And you actually build it to where the communities are involved and are benefiting and are seeing what's happening. Now it gets into rebuilding trust. Now it gets into benefiting. So if you're aligning with the local health department, and the health department's out there and they're visibly part of this, if you're aligning with the doctors and the hospitals and the insurance companies are getting a part of this, if you're aligning with, the governor's office and the sustainability department and all that, and you do that really publicly and you do that in a way that people can actually see the impact, now you start pushing back against this feeling of helplessness and hopelessness that I think we're collectively seeing that's advancing across the country and around the world. Is like, nothing else matters. We can't do anything. We're screwed. Well, that's not true.
Right.
That's a false idea that we need to step away from.
Yeah, there's a lot of fear out there. And, one of the reasons why I'm so fixated on pathways communities is that sense of hope, restoring hope. And that comes through upward mobility, right? That comes through empowerment, that comes through knowledge, that comes through helping others make those connections. You're talking about sort of a network effect in your clear description there of how many different nodes can get connected into this thing, and how the extractive models, the linear extractive models, won't have an opportunity to participate, because if they don't restore value and benefit back to another node, then they're less valuable. So by design, you're creating a system that engineers the value and benefit into a regenerative process, and really doesn't allow for extractive and linear services or extractive and linear hierarchical processes to infiltrate. And look, it's not, it's not an evil thing. It's just a different way of looking at things. And that's why I love what you're working on, man.
And just to touch on that really quickly, it's not even, so Buckminster Fuller said it best. It's not necessary to tear down legacy systems. All we got to do is build systems that make more sense, and the old ways become obsolete. But what's interesting about this is by going in and intentionally filling a vacuum, and by really focusing on collaboration and alignment and bringing in all the stakeholders and really understanding the full extent of the systemic elements that we're dealing with, we can even take a step farther than, like, I'm not demonizing corporations, far from it. I think that, supermarkets have their place. I think that restaurants have their place. I think that large capacity, like food preparation. I've been on a military facility. I've been in the dining facility, for years. That has its place. The thing is, all we need to do as a society is recognize that we need to put some functions on the back end so that these systems cause less destruction.
Agreed.
And the biggest thing, and this is one of the biggest kind of points that I really want to make, is we need to stop demonizing corporations and trying to yell at them to change their operations, when instead we can create operations that are symbiotic with theirs, to where they can continue doing what they're doing, but now they're partnering with us, maybe as a waste management contract, maybe as a public-private partnership, maybe we even install a blast chiller in their kitchen, so they're figuring, like we can actually, like, one of the strategies I'm going to use is approaching major corporations and just installing a blast chiller in their kitchen.
Right.
And teaching their staff how to use it. Now they're reducing costs internally. They're not wasting as much. They're actually seeing an impact on their bottom line, and they're paying a small rent for that blast chiller to the nonprofit, to the public benefit company, which is helping us to keep the whole thing flowing and to expand and to sustain our operations. And ultimately, that's what we need, is sustainable operations.
The reason that I chuckled was because it reminds me of a conversation I had with my friend Charlie. We were up in Raleigh at the Open Source Technology Conference, a couple months ago. And he's a great thinker, and I think he'll get a kick out of this. We were walking through a parking lot, and I can't remember what we were talking about specifically, but essentially he was telling me that I needed to make it work quicker. He was conveying to me this sense of urgency, and And I just stopped and I laughed and I said, it's kind of like yelling at a plant to grow faster, you know? And what you just said sort of reminded me of that, right? Like, it's like yelling at a corporation to change.
Yeah.
Like, you can't, you
And
can't
that's all
yell
we're
at,
doing.
no, it's not how that works. You have to build a better system. And then that system will be adopted by other systems because it's better. But this notion of yelling at emergence to make it better is the same as trying to fertilize a plant. So I love that you're taking that perspective too, because so many people in the green, sustainable, regenerative movement, they've sort of declared war when it's not a war opportunity. It's an opportunity to work together because, to your point, if we can start to benefit from limiting extractive systems, we all benefit.
Yeah,
And
try
there's
telling that to an activist that sees protest in the street and waving signs as the only path.
well, you can't. It's the same as talking to a capitalist and saying that they should wait for value and benefit. It's there's and when you have one path and one goal and it's linear,
Yeah.
you're wrong on both sides,
Or
right?
try telling a lobbyist that there's ways other than policy fights to make a difference.
Yeah, it's not going to happen. That's not circular systems thinking. That's not regenerative thinking. Systems thinking and regenerative thinking require you to truly think through the entire process and focus on benefit and value and focus on limiting extraction or allowing for the capital revenue model to take place, but not allowing for it to go off the rails and become extractive to a point where the dependencies are then created and the tidal wave of shareholders comes in, and then you have to constantly appease shareholders through stock value. That's not going to work.
One of the interesting things, so I've been going through the Regenerative process for the past 5 months. I'm getting ready to go do the intensive next month or at the end of this month, and I thought I knew systems thinking. I mean, I really thought that I was pretty good at this stuff. You know, I walked in, I think I had a little bit of an ego and everything like that. And they hit me with a truth a couple of months ago that absolutely blew my mind. And it just allowed me to expand my thought processes so much farther than I think I'd even allowed myself to do before. Is truly regenerative thinking is when we can stop thinking of the problems that we keep thinking about as problems. Is when we can get our heads wrapped around the idea that these things that we see as challenges are actually opportunities. That these evil people or evil systems or whatever they're looking at are actually part of our system. They're actually part of the thing that we need to incorporate. Like when we figure that out, we're going to win.
No doubt. 24 years of entrepreneurship has taught me how to recognize opportunity. And opportunity comes in very difficult places. You have to be willing to explore dark depths and hard conversations and true raw emotions and people who will die on just about every hill. And you have to pass through all of that in order to really get through to see that new perspective and to notice that it's an opportunity. But what's really hard, Shannon, is then seeing that opportunity and getting it to product market fit or timing to market.
Right.
And, the regenerative movement, this is nothing new. Just like industrialized offsite construction struggling with. For 25 years, people have been frustrated. There are better ways. But the market just maybe wasn't ready, or there was no institutional or industrialized or global adoption of it because the concept and the understanding wasn't there, which is also part of our Pathways community is digital equity. If you can't be curious, if I would never have learned what I've learned if I didn't have a Google search bar and then a bunch of academic papers that I could access from the comfort of my own home. That's a privilege for sure, that I not only have the time, but I have the resources to take the time to learn, to study, to question. But without access to the internet, if I was using encyclopedias from the 80s like I grew up on, my research would be 4 years behind. I'd be a month into 4 years of research still. Yeah. So digital equity is super, super important because even if you don't have a curriculum and access to traditional education, you can be curious.
Yep.
Right. And that leads to this.
That is actually one of the things that I'm really, really excited about right now is that we've got two technologies that are coming down the pipeline that are set to kind of change everything as far as democratization of access and democratization of governance. Like I love going into the Web3 world and getting an understanding of smart contracts and getting an understanding of fractional ownership and getting an understanding of how we can essentially use the internet to control ownership and distribution of resources in the real world. Like that's big.
And that's the point of this podcast is bricks to clicks, is looking at assets and seeing things as they used to be in their physical form and realizing that there's a virtual version of all of it now. Yeah. And that virtual version is emerging. So there's a virtual economy. There are currencies associated with that economy. There are fractional ownership opportunities through the utility of blockchain and through the utility of fractional ownership through proof of work and proof of stake. You can prove provenance. You can track ordinal and cardinal numbers, fractional share ownership, it is just on and on and on and on.
I've only touched I've dipped my toe into it so far, and I'm already fascinated. So, it's going to be a lifelong challenge figuring it out. And hopefully I'll be able to align with folks that are way smarter than me, because my brain's not going to let me code.
Yeah, no, that's the cool thing about it, is that I look at it like the nutrition label. The ingredients used to not even have to be on the package. And then the nutrition label got bigger. It was ingredients and then also nutritional information. So, I look at it that way, is that if you've been exposed to it, it's kind of hard to unsee it. You can't just ignore it, and that is a solution that exists. So it's like anything else in this world that's complex. You have to subscribe to it. You have to commit to it. If it's health, if it's wellness and nutrition, if it's a workout schedule, whatever it might be, technology is becoming that, where you can no longer afford to put it away and ignore it for a year or two. You have to do a little bit every day, or create enough of, curiosity and awareness into your schedule where you study it for a couple hours a week or whatever. But, I was listening. I've been down the rabbit hole of consensus mechanisms and the utility behind Bitcoin lately. And I heard that it takes an hour to understand MicroStrategy, Michael Saylor's company of research. It takes 100 hours to understand Bitcoin, and it takes 1,000 hours to become a Bitcoin max. So, it's kind of like being playing an instrument. It's the same thing. You have to start somewhere. So, if you want to learn, so that's what I did. And I started some years ago. I was introduced to Michael Saylor and what he was doing with MicroStrategy. And now I've definitely surpassed the 100 hours of Bitcoin. And I'm not doing it for cryptocurrency and to rip the face off and rug somebody else financially and be that guy. I'm doing it because once you understand the utility behind it, it's like, holy mackerel, man.
Yeah.
Not unlike the understanding the nutritional value of an apple now versus 20 years ago.
For sure. So you touched on pathways a couple of times. Let's talk about that for a second, because we had a kind of really brief touch on it a few days ago. We were talking about potential applications and collaborations between housing and food, and I thought that was a really interesting path.
Yeah, so let's talk about that for a minute. So the three sort of cornerstone conditions of a pathways community, as I was mentioning earlier, is financial acuity, digital access, and upward mobility. And those are sort of three social programs that have to be built in. The goal is to really reduce or maybe even erase the stigma of affordable housing and to stabilize housing for the middle class. So I think there are three trails. I think we could do civil service, where we have teachers, nurses, first responders, artists, musicians. That can be one customer profile that we could build communities for. Another one could be age in place. We have a lot of aging folks that have exited the workforce, but they're on fixed incomes and they're subject to all the issues associated with inflation. And third is that workforce housing piece. Mm-hmm. So the idea is to go out there and to have those sort of three perspectives in place as we move affordable housing from affordable to attainable, sustainable housing. And I think that one of the cool things about it is that they're going to participate in the positive side of equity. If in affordable housing, one of the biggest problems is that the two extractions happen at the very beginning. Your master developer and your general contractor generally tend to make the money. They build the project exactly as they said they would. And it's always first cost that they're paying attention to. Once the ribbon is cut and the tenants move in, that's total cost of ownership. And things start to happen, like caulk lines start to dry and windows start to crack and water starts to intrude. And you've got this ongoing maintenance cost because you've built a quote unquote cheap structure. Mm-hmm. On top of that, the tenants have no ownership. They have no pride. So they come in and they treat the housing as if it were not theirs. And so the sliding scale of issues associated with the ongoing maintenance of that facility. Pathways housing or Pathways communities are proposing that for total tenancy that they actually participate in the upside of equity. So Excellent. It looks something like this. Okay. You apply, you get into a space, You move into a 500 square foot studio. Life goes, you have access to a financial advisor or somebody on the financial side of things. And it's fixed rent and it's fully included with all your utilities. So the idea is to give you an opportunity to save a little bit of cash as you're working. Maybe your life progresses and you find a partner and you need some more space. So you can sell out of your 500 square foot studio to the next person who wants in and move into a 750 square foot studio, maybe in the same campus. We're looking at it maybe as office park that's been repurposed.
Okay.
Or an old school that, private school that didn't work. Something like that already has the initial infrastructure in place.
There's 3 of them in Pueblo.
Yeah, not high-rise buildings in central business districts like people, like the architects and engineers will tell you they want to do. I don't want to repurpose that. Maybe then they progress a little bit more in their 750 square foot townhouse. It just isn't big enough for them. They want a dog and a grill. Maybe they want to have a kid. Well, on that same campus, in that same community, they can sell out of their 750 square foot townhouse and into a 800 to 1200 square foot single family house that has a little backyard, little patio house. And all of that, during their time there, they're going to build community. They're going to build resilience. They're going to have built some financial acuity. And the goal there is to progress out of that community and be able to participate productively in the housing world that it is, the 20% down, the best interest rate that you can get because you're highly qualified at that point.
I was
It's
going to
really
ask
to
you
take
about
that
that.
vulnerability from that early days of your career, and to maybe take those first 8 or 9 years or 10 years even, and just to live in a community that gets it, that shares financial modeling and that has access to great information and has access to things that mostly wealthy people have access to, being a financial advisor, being gigabit Ethernet, and bringing together that community with the social fabric that it wants to create. That's why I think the food piece fits so well, because those farmers then have, let's say there's 200 people in a Pathways community. That farmer knows that every Wednesday he or she can deliver CSA because that community has already engaged them because they have a farm partner, right? There's going to be a community kitchen in every one of these Pathways communities. So you can do prep, you can cut and peel and talk and listen to music or whatever as a community. And then maybe there's a store, maybe there's a deli or a small bodega right there in the park that you can participate in, and support and patronize. So anyway, it's still early days, but the amount of feedback that we're getting and the amount of interest we're getting is wild.
I believe it. Yeah, housing is a big deal right now. I'm curious about one aspect of it. When folks transition, again, theory, but when folks transition out of the Pathways housing back into the regular market, are they able to take some of that equity with them to contribute towards the down payment and everything?
Yes, that's the goal. So part of the model with Habitat for Humanity is that the land is usually put in trust. So the Habitat houses, the land is not part of the equity of the home,
Yeah, I've read
which
that.
controls the inflationary aspect of flipping. So, and that's how they maintain their community. So you're only participating in the upside of the equity of the structure itself. So
Gotcha.
there's a different asset manager and a different valuation process in play there, where when you're talking about doing the evaluations of the financial modeling, it's only the structure itself, which forces us as the master developer to build the very best product we can. So it flips that other model, the affordable housing model, on its head. And it says, no, let's spend all the money we can, because the longer this building is in place and the more resilient the building is, the more we can bring people through our Pathways community, the lower it is to worry about our OPEX, because we don't have those ongoing maintenance costs because we built it right in the first place, right? And that's why they can participate in equity. And the goal, obviously, is to continue the economy that we live in is going to continue to inflate. So just by participating in that first 500 square foot town and being qualified to move in there, having a job, being a civil servant, and having a regular meeting with a financial advisor every month, if we make those requirements, then they're going to be saving a portion of their income, because they're not going to have to be worried about spikes on interest rates or spikes on insurance or, spikes on whatever, all the things associated with the total cost of ownership of a house. So if we can lower those financial outputs, and control that, put it into a sort of a forced savings for them, let them participate in the upside of equity of the structure, and then progress from 500 to 750, 2 bedrooms to a single family home out. They should, by virtue, while the rest of the world is moving through their traditional economic cycles, they should progress out and have 20% down on a median house, which the goal would be 80 grand, because that's what you need now.
What if, it's always the scariest conversation to start with, what if, so as a thought experiment, what if that commercial kitchen was actually part of the equity building stack?
Tell me more.
So going back to the earlier in the conversation, we were talking about how we could take food that was destined for the landfill and turn it into new products, right? So the add value cycle in food is pretty straightforward. If you take an apple and you sell it in the market, it's going to be worth what an apple's worth. If you take it and turn it into applesauce, it's going to be worth what applesauce is worth. If you take it and turn it into an apple pie, it's going to be worth what an apple pie is worth. So the more effort you put into it, the more valuation. And obviously, like where you put it's important too. If you put it in a grocery store where it's competing against all the other applesauces, it's going to be worth one thing. If you put it into, let's say, a grocery store that you control where you're not competing with 20 other brands, it's going to be worth maybe a different thing. And the expenses go into the valuation on that as well. So one of the challenge / opportunities that we're going to be dealing with moving forward into that level of food rescue, and we're talking about accelerating gleaning to the point where we're incorporating fruit trees in people's backyards, when we're incorporating restaurant meals, when we're incorporating all of these different products that can be repackaged and redirected into different parts of society where it's worth more than it is at the end of the night at the restaurant or at the end of the week at the grocery store or wherever it is that we're pulling from. That food is going to go out in the market and it's going to transmit its value back into the community. So what if these folks are having an opportunity to be involved with that food processing capacity? You know, their skills certification, kit training, they're just, you know, volunteering time in the kitchen, whatever it is that they're doing, that ends up getting, again, going back to the Web3, gets granularly tracked. And as we start getting the food back into the market and as we start creating these capacities, that goes back into the same bank and it helps to grow the entire model.
We're 100% on the same page. I think that could be a theme of that particular resilient pathways community, is that particular asset that we improved and repositioned as the developers of the pathways community for, let's just say, civil servants. If that's the trail, that's what we're calling them. You know, there's 3 trails: that upward mobility, civil service. The second trail is the age in place. The third trail is workforce housing. If we were to say be the master developers, reposition an asset, and when we came into that particular site during site selection, there was a massive, awesome kitchen in it, then that would obviously be like sort of its first and highest and best use is, dude, this should be a pathways community associated with like food, regenerative food, or maybe there's a 5-acre water retention field that's off to the side of the kitchen. That could be a farm. Like the farmer could be growing or having chickens, or, you know, the key is to bring the product to the consumer, right? Because you're going to lower all that dependency on energy. So now what if your CSA through your farmer, what if your farmer looked at it and said, wait, why am I growing all that stuff up there? I could be growing it here. Well, now they've got land in an urban area, right? Which is better for everybody. I totally see that as being a potential woven social economic development opportunity inside of a pathways community. The one thing that I don't want to do as the mastermind behind this, is theme these things. I want them to emerge. So if that community chooses that, you know, that the food supply chain is part of their fabric, part of their woven, you know, their social fabric that needs to be woven into their community, that's awesome. Right. Whereas the next one might be something completely different. You know, an age in place community might see tennis courts and think pickleball, or, you know, whatever. I'm making all of this up, but you know what I mean? Like, I don't want to be Disney and say, okay, this is Epcot, that's Germany, be German. Lederhosen for everyone. I want to come in and say, this is a pathways community. We are going to stabilize the rents. We are going to create a sense and opportunity for upward mobility, digital equity, and financial acuity around each one of these. That's a given. Go. And I feel like these communities are going to emerge.
If I can, I want to partially agree with that.
Push back.
So here's one of the things that I see as I go through this process is, as a society, we tend to vote for bread and circuses. We tend to vote for what we want. So the pickleball courts, the whatever, and there's certainly a place for that. But one of the things, so just focusing on age and place type of situations, one of the major structural problems that we're dealing with as a society is senior aging and isolation. And part of that is capacity. And part of that is I can't function in a kitchen anymore and I don't have anybody to help me with the kitchen. So that's part of it, is the physical structure of how do I get healthy food and how do I get something that tastes good.
Right.
But such a big part of that is also that community connection around food. And one of the biggest things, and again, I'm hyper focused on food because it's my thing, but one of the things that we have to recognize as a species is that food is the heart of community for us. We grow up around the kitchen table. All of our major decisions are made around the kitchen table. That is the strongest memories that we have from early age. In many cases, is that smell and that sight of mom and dad, cooking in the kitchen and doing all these things, or smoking in the grill, or all of these different things. And so, I would argue that if we don't have a structure that incorporates these things that we understand at the highest level, because there's researchers and there's social workers and there's scientists and there's folks that have been studying this stuff for decades, and we do have an understanding of what we need as a society. And I think that we need to some extent, to program those elements in so that we can engineer these strategies in a way that are beneficial to society as a standardized model. And I think that there's a lot of room for customization in there. And going back to the grocery store thing, it's the same thing that we've developed with the grocery stores. I've got a seed model of pantry staples that we can use as the core of a grocery store. And then we can take that and move it into any community, and we can have surveys and community engagement meetings and all of these processes to determine, okay, here's the seed of what our store is. What else do you want? What else do you need? Do you want this to be a Costco redistribution last mile location? Do you want this to be, blanched vegetables that are already pre-chopped, so you don't have to do the prep work at home? Do you want, shelf stable product like sauces that can add flavor to any meal, so that you can get that that Korean barbecue, or you can get that whatever flavor it is that you need? And we could literally have like culturally appropriate flavors that are the spice mixes and the different things, and literally just take the heavy lifting process of understanding how to make a sauce off the table.
Mm-hmm.
And okay, so you show up with your fresh vegetables, you show up with your protein, whatever that is. I'm not getting into the argument about whose protein is right, but you just simplify the process by removing the barriers to, like, the knowledge barriers, the access barriers, the cooking barriers, all of these different things. And the same thing I think could apply to housing. If you've got certain key things that are like, these are the goals we want to accomplish with this, these are the metrics we want to hit, these are the medical and societal organizations we want to partner with, these are the research organizations that we want to partner with to be able to get, like, what's the results of this? Because as a tech person, you probably understand as well as I do, if we can't measure it, it doesn't exist. You have to be, everything that we develop has to be measurable. We have to be able to replicate it. We have to be able to scale it. And we have to be able to say, this is what the impact was. And one of the biggest challenges we're dealing with in the food system is that nobody's bothering to measure it.
I don't feel like that was a pushback. I feel like that was something that, like, you partially agreed, but I think I totally can relate to that. And I know I agree with you 100%. You know my story a little bit, in that I was in food and beverage for a lot of years too. So, it's a passion part of me. I cook every single night. I can't find a meal out that is as good as what we cook at home anymore. And most of it's just because I can use better ingredients. I love the process. I put the music on. If I want to pop a bottle of wine, I don't have to pay $12 a glass or $18 a glass. And we made all of our massive family decisions so far at this point in my life around the dinner table. We're still one of the last traditional families that sits around the dinner table multiple nights a week and comes together and eats. So I agree with you 100% that the cornerstone of community can be found at the food. 100%.
I'm incredibly jealous right now, by the way.
Why is that?
So one of the issues that I deal with is I'm actually food insecure. One of the interesting side effects of the stroke that I got back in the 90s is that I really struggle in the kitchen. I'm one of those people that I can't figure out the buttons. I don't understand the timing. I get lost when I'm doing the steps of cooking. I will walk away and forget that I'm cooking. I can't tell you how many fires I've started.
Wow.
And so it's a challenge for me personally. Like one of the major motivations of why I'm in this is because I'm self-advocating. And so when I
Amazing.
hear you talking about eating at home and everything like that, I'm like, oh, wouldn't that be nice?
Well, that's amazing. That's amazing. What an awesome perspective that you could lend on that then. That's why you're so programmatic into your compartmentalizing how to put together a plate of food, right? Because if you can make it a jar of this, 2 bags of that, and a protein, and 10 minutes of focus with a stick of butter or some olive oil,
I'll
and
tell
you
you a
don't
story.
move away from it. It's a one pot skillet wonder, but it's all fresh and healthy, and you don't have to get lost in a recipe because it's so freaking
Yeah.
complicated.
Keep it simple, stupid. I had where I got this from was, I don't know, 2017. I had just started the nonprofit organization and I was having a Thanksgiving dinner. And there was actually two epiphanies that I got that week. One is I was going down and getting ingredients from Winco, which is a co-op grocery store that's in about 5 or 6 states over on the west side. And this is like a 45,000 square foot warehouse space that's got everything under the sun. It's about the same size as a Costco. They're freaking huge. And I was making a beeline over to the bulk section because that's where I needed to get, my flour, and I needed to get my spices, and I needed to get a few things for this meal that I was making, which was a leftover turkey pot pie. So it was like a couple of days after Thanksgiving. I'm like, I'm going to use this. I'm going to make some pot pies. So I go in there and I get into the bulk section, and all of a sudden my jaw hit the floor and I just stopped there. And I'm looking around at this maybe 1,000 square foot section of the store that's kind of hidden over in the corner. And I had this realization that this little tiny section has about 95% of everything that people need to be able to eat healthy at home, to be able to cook a meal, to be able to put all of those ingredients together. And so that was that was where I got the idea of re-engineering the store down to be bulk spices and bulk food and commodity goods, and really stepping away from the brands completely and stepping outside of the global supply chain to operate these stores into these inner city areas, because that's where it starts. That's where the profits start happening. That's where the markup, you don't have the 5 layers of markup. You don't have all of those different things. So that was one epiphany. And then I get my stuff home and I'm starting to cook it up, and I'm getting frustrated because I'm doing the sauce for the pot pie. And I don't know if you've ever made one of those, but you got to go through and you got to make the roux and you got to stir it and you got to have the even heat and you got to pay attention and all this other stuff. And it is making my mind explode. Like I'm literally losing my shit in the kitchen. And I'm like, and then I realized, wow, all of these processes, and I had heard about, industrial cooking equipment. And I've never actually functioned in a commercial kitchen. I've never worked in a restaurant or anything, but people were describing that how they have these giant jacketed tubs that were like 500-liter tubs that you could throw a bunch of food in, and it's got these paddles that spin around and it's heated all the way up the side. And they've got these places, this equipment that you could use where you just dump all your food in, you push a button and you walk away, and it cooks all the food for you, and it does it correctly, and it does it to spec, and it's the same thing every time. And you've got this whole standardization process in the factories. And I'm like, how cool would it be if we did that with sauces? How cool would that be if we did that with the building blocks of ingredients, so that when we have a recipe and that recipe's got 9 steps that's just building the frickin' sauce, and
Mm-hmm.
the rest of it is put it all in a pot and cook it. What if we outsourced that portion and then made that available? And what's really funny is a few years later, I was in Costco. I love picking on that company. It's one of my favorite places. And I go down one of the aisles, and you've got these shelf stable aisles where you got all the stuff. And Kinder's and a couple other brands have started doing that. They've actually, you can go in and you can get a bottle, a squeeze tube of Korean barbecue flavor.
Right.
You can go,
Exactly.
you can go in and you can get a squeeze tube of damn near whatever flavor you want. And that, I think, is going to be one of the keys. And I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. So like, we're going to use our end of life ingredients to create these products to be able to push this out in the community. But I'm just as happy driving down the street to Costco and bringing that to the store.
Yeah, yeah, and think about the margins, right? Like to your point earlier about the benefit value and benefit of the community. If you have a community store that is taking advantage of the food waste, and that quote unquote food waste became something of profit, right? I mean, that's in our house when we finish, if we have a whole roasted chicken, we don't throw those bones away. We cover that with water. We put bay leaves and peppercorns in it. We stick it in the crock pot. We put it on overnight and we do it for 2 or 3 cycles and we make our chicken broth out of that. And that, like, we still do that. And all of our friends make fun of us. So, like, you can buy a chicken broth. I'm like, this is just water. And like, I put it over the top and like in a day and a half, I have chicken stock and it cost me literally nothing. The chicken in the first place was $8. It fed us 3 times. And then I took the bones and I got the flavor of the bones out. And now I've got the base for my soup. And if I boil that base down for my soup, I have bouillon. So now I can put that in the fridge and it's pasty. And now I can flavor my food with it. So we do that here because my wife and I enjoy that process. Like, and that's just because we have access to the kitchen and we have time and I'm cheap. So that's part of it, is that when I see something and physically have to throw it away, the first thought that goes through my mind is, do I need this? I have a farm. Like, we don't throw things away. Like, when you have space to keep things, we have piles of mowers, we have tires, we have, L brackets, we have rebar, like we have a steel scrap pile. Like, we just have things because I revisit them on the regular. Like, well, I need something to whatever. I go over and I find it. It's 30 miles for me to go to Lowe's, and then I got to use dollars that I had to work really hard to make in order to buy something that I'm only going to use 10% of anyway, right? So my whole life I lived this way.
It's interesting that you talk about this too, because that is what you're talking about right now is a cornerstone of the perspective shift that I'm trying to introduce to, I hate using the term entitled, but to the folks like us who grew up in an environment where we were not used to thinking in terms of lack. We're not used to thinking in terms of scarcity, in terms of not having like basic functionalities that people assume that everybody has. And so one of the biggest things about what I do is everything that I do and everything that I think about and all of the strategies that I put together are specifically in solidarity with 15% of our society that is invisible and that's dealing with invisible barriers that the rest of us don't even know exist. When I was doing business, when I was running my bars in downtown Reno, 4th Street used to be the highway that would go across the town. And then, back in the 50s or 60s, they developed the 80 freeway going through, and 4th Street ended up drying up. And so now they've got all of these motels from back in the 1950s that have been converted into weeklies. And what's interesting about that is that if you go into a weekly motel, there's no kitchen. There's a bar fridge and a microwave. And a lot of times you've got the landlords that put policies in place where you're not even allowed to cook in your room. And so that forces people, again, to go to that bodega and get that microwave burrito because it's the only food you can literally are allowed to cook.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of folks that I talk to that are even well-meaning folks in this space have a tough time wrapping their head around the fact that there's folks that don't have a kitchen. But if you go down to the food pantry and you talk to food pantry workers, they will tell you about folks that stand in line and they get a box of food and they look at it and be like, what the fuck am I supposed to do with this?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times they'll pick 1 or 2 things out of that box of food and then leave the box on the curb outside because they don't have any way to cook the food.
So I think when in my course I was working a little bit today on energy within environmental constraints, that continuing ed course I'm taking, and I'll go back now because you just piqued my interest. I think I saw that 1.8 billion people on the planet don't have a kitchen. They can cook over an open fire. That's different. I think that there's some crazy like 500 million people that don't even have that. But 1.8 billion people on the planet don't have a kitchen.
And you want to get fucked with even more?
I mean, that's mind your mind around that. 1 out of 8 people on the planet.
Yeah. So listen to this one. According to the American Periodontist Association, over 40 million Americans don't have teeth.
40 million.
40 million.
Yeah, you're right.
And over half the country is missing at least one tooth. So when you talk about how do I eat this apple?
Yeah. Right. Here's a bunch of apples for toothless people.
Yeah.
Right. Having that awareness for mixing, the right food with the right people.
Yeah. It's like, how do you get past these invisible barriers when we don't talk about them? We don't even see them if you're not personally experiencing this stuff, you never see it.
My rural neighbors that I've grown to love, like, second grade education, they can fix anything. They're way smarter than so many of us in so many ways, but yet so ignorant in so many other ways. When you're in the city, you might call them hicks, right? Or hillbillies, or rednecks, or
Yeah.
bootnecks, or
I've been on both
bootstrappers.
sides of the aisle, so I wouldn't go
Well,
there.
right. So am I, right? So when I get up to the farm, they call us idiots. So, and I love that term because, when I'm here in the city, I get it. When I'm up there, I get it. I try to be as resilient and as independent as possible in both places that I am. I turn my lights off. I don't like waste. I help my neighbor. Just the basic constructs of community building that make resilience. As a result of that, of the olive branch of looking out for my neighbors, I've got some pretty good allies in my life. You
That's
know,
awesome.
Everything from needing to have my mail brought in the city to fixing a hydraulic hose on my tractor. It's good to have that network of people that you can relate to because you can offer help and guidance. So people have to be willing to do it.
And that's one of our big challenges too, and opportunities. And going back to the grocery store model that I've developed, one of the big advantages of going that route and of creating a system like this is it creates an opportunity to build a stake for the farming community in urban food security.
Absolutely.
And that creates the potential for a bridge and a crossover where people can start to get to know each other in ways that we have, especially as a country, but certainly as a society, we've struggled to do that. And we've been seeing this kind of widening rift and this gap between the urban and rural communities where both of them kind of feel like the other one's ignoring them and we're not getting benefits out of it. And like the urbans are just kind of sitting there like the Eloi and the time machine. I wrote an article about that, and just like, oh, food magically appears and we have no idea where our food comes from. And the farming community is like, well, it's coming from right here and we could use a little help over here. So that dynamic, I think, if we can just generally, and it goes into the housing situation too. Like how can the farming community benefit from urban housing? How can the urban community benefit from access to farms? How can we increase the amount of students that are going out to the country? How can we, kind of create these systems and these programs to where we've got more handshake between urban and rural groups?
Well, I don't have the answer, but I love that we're on the same path, brother.
Absolutely.
And I love that you took some time to share your thoughts and your progress with me. I did read through Fractal Farms. It's very comprehensive, and I love it. And I'm glad that
Thank
we
you.
got a chance to sit here and riff on this for a little while.
Yeah, thanks for sharing your platform.
How can people reach you? How would you like to be reached, or whatever? I'll put it in the show notes.
So my website is a mess right now. I've got a guy helping me build it back up again. We're going to be livingsys.org probably in about 2 weeks. But if you can reach me on LinkedIn, Shannon Dobbs, that's where I basically post all my writings and thought leadership. And I'm working on making the global connections with the scientific community and all the different stakeholders at that level. So I think probably LinkedIn.
Cool. Yeah, well, that's where we've met, and it continues to blow me away how powerful that network has become. So
It's crazy.
we will definitely stay in touch. I appreciate you sharing the space with us today for an hour and 20. There's some nuggets in here for sure.
My pleasure.
I
Thanks
wish
for
you
the
the
invite.
best of luck, and hopefully we're better together.
You as well.
Cheers, brother.
Cheers.